Welcome back to another Azure SQL Database tutorial. So previous video, we were talking more about how do we connect to our Azure SQL Database using the Azure Data Studio. So as you can tell, I'm a little bit biased. I really like that tool, but there are also other ways to connect to a SQL database that is hosted on Azure using things like PYODBC and even Visual Studio Code. So what we're going to cover in this video is we're going to show you how to connect to the Azure SQL database using PYODBC. So PYODBC is a Python library that allows you to connect to ODBC databases using Python. So I've actually written a few videos on this particular topic, but they were never specific to Microsoft Azure. Now, I will say it's almost identical. I mean, it's literally almost exactly the same method, but there are a few little caveats that you have to be aware of when it comes to connecting to that database. So the first thing that we're going to do in this video is I'm going to first show you some of the documentation that is related to the PYODBC connection and explain a little bit about what Microsoft is going to walk you through if you want to get a little bit more of an in-depth explanation. So first things first, let's go take a look. And I'll make sure to have this link in the descriptions. But if you go to, it's very deep, Docs, SQL, Connect, Python, you will find a section for the Python SQL driver, and it will be specific to PYODBC. In this particular little documentation, they talk about how to configure your development environment so that you can use the PYODBC package. There are a few requirements that you need to have on your system in order to do this. Probably the most obvious one, and should go without explanation, is you do need Python installed on your system. Obviously, if you don't have Python, you can't use the Python PYODBC package. Additionally, you do need to make sure that you install the PYODBC package. There are different ways to do that, but Microsoft gives you a very simple example right here, which is using pip install PYODBC. This is probably the easiest and most straightforward way. You just have to make sure that when you do install it, that you're installing it in the correct location. I will show you how to do it inside of Visual Studio Code. So if you go back here, assuming that you have a Python environment activated, and that can be determined by looking right down here, you'll notice that it says Python 3.84. So in my particular situation, I have a Python environment activated. So what I can do is, now that it's activated, I can do Control-J to bring up the terminal. And you can see right now it's highlighted on problems. I want to go over here to terminal. And from here, what I can do is I can do pip install PYODBC. And then it will install that package for me. Now you can obviously tell that it's saying that I already have this package, so it's not going to install it for me again. Now I could, if I wanted to, upgrade it, but that's really unnecessary for this particular video. So it will walk you through the installation process. There's nothing you have to do, but you're probably going to see a little bit more output than what you just saw on my particular system. So once you've installed PYODBC, that's the first thing taken care of. We'll go back over here. They also give you some different options if it goes to, if you're on a Linux system or something like that. Now, additionally, you will need to install a particular driver. And so the driver basically allows the communication to a particular ODBC database. Now, at the top, you'll see Python SQL Driver PYODBC. And then if you go on this page, you'll see this section that it says to install SQL Driver for Python. And so if you click this, you will be taken to this particular page, and they will talk about all the different installations that you need. You'll notice here, download ODBC. And then if you click on that link, you'll be redirected to this page. There is a section for Windows. And then if you scroll down a little bit, there is a section for Linux and Mac as well. So you obviously want to install the one that is for your particular operating system. I'm on Windows, and so you can see here, there's the 64 and then the 86. Most time you want to make sure that you're installing the right version based on your operating system. And so I usually start with the 64 one. This one tends to work fine for me, but you can, if necessary, use the 86. So it really just depends, depending on what type of database you're trying to connect to. So you just kind of have to look and see what are the specific requirements for your particular database. But in my situation, it was the 64 one. And then once you've done that, you're actually pretty much good to go. So you would just download it, and then you could open it and install it. The installation is very straightforward, so I'm not going to walk through that, but that's basically what you would do. Additionally, if you would like some more documentation related to using PYODBC, I would highly recommend that you go to MK Lee Hammer. So this is the individual who created the PYODBC package. And then from here, if you want some more in-depth discussions about particular topics or particular use cases, this would probably be your go-to point. So you can see here, there's a section related to documentation, and he's got it broken out on different topics. So if you want to connect to particular databases, they're showing you how you would do so on different topics. So for example, Microsoft SQL Server for Windows and stuff like that. So very straightforward. It's very well documented. So hopefully not too many issues related to that. Okay, and so once you've done that, and once we've gone through kind of the whole big headache related to doing the installation stuff, we can actually walk through the process of connecting to our database using PYODBC. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to import some packages. The first one is going to be TextWrap. This is simply because I'm going to be building a connection string, and for readability, I'm going to be putting it on new lines and having tabs in there and stuff like that. We want to make sure that when we connect to our database that we kind of clean it up and we don't have all these line breaks and stuff like that. So TextWrap will help us do that. Additionally, we're going to be using obviously the PYODBC library because we want to connect to it. The first thing that I like to do is I like to specify the driver that I'm going to be using to connect to my particular database. Now, in this case, the one you're going to want is the ODBC driver 17 for SQL Server. At least at the time of recording this video, this would be the one that more than likely you're going to want to use. There are multiple versions of the SQL Server driver. If you are on a different operating system, if you're on a different version of a particular SQL Server, you might have to change the driver, but for our particular purposes to connect to our SQL database that is on Azure, this should be the driver that you need to use. If not, there's probably something else going on that might be determining why that one's not working. I would say first, make sure that that driver is actually installed on your system. If it's not, then try to make sure that you go through the process I just talked about, which is installing it, or potentially look at some other options about, did you set up your SQL database correctly and things along that nature. So this usually is pretty static. This shouldn't be changing, but obviously they might come out with updates and stuff like that. So just keep an eye. It might not always be this specific one. Additionally, I need to specify some other information. So I'm going to specify the server name and the database name. Okay. So the first one will be my server name. In this case, remember, it's Sigma Coding Tutorials. That's the name of my server. And then I have a database name. The database name in this one is Sigma Coding Test. That's the name of the database. And then from here, I need to actually create the server string. So this is something specific to Microsoft Azure. This alone will not do it for you. You need to actually build a server string that is specific to Microsoft Azure. Now, if you want a little bit of a cheat to kind of get you started, then I would highly recommend you go to Azure itself. So if you want, go to your Azure dashboard. And then if you remember before, when you go to your SQL database, there are connection strings. So for example, if I go to my Sigma Coding Tutorials SQL Server, I can see my databases. So I'm going to click this. And then from here, I'm now on my database. And if I go down to the settings section, notice there is a portion specified for connection strings. Then from here, I can see the connection strings that I need. Now, you can use this. You just have to keep in mind, you have to make sure that you have the driver that is specified here and things along that nature. So you can technically use this. You just need to make sure you have the correct driver. Note here, they are using ODBC driver 13. Now, I'll tell you a little bit later, but there's a disadvantage to using the driver 13 compared to the driver 17 when it comes to using PYODBC. That is related to the execute many method. So this is for doing bulk inserts. I believe with driver 13, you can't use execute many. So it's not going to perform in a faster fashion than if you were just looping through each one. But you'll notice here, they have the server name. On this particular server name, they have TCP, the name of the server, .database, .windows, .net, and then the port. Now the TCP, if I remember correctly, and don't quote me exactly on this, I believe this has something to do with like the, whether it's kind of like an encrypted connections to a certain extent, but I tend to leave this one out. The only reason why is that I notice my connections go a lot quicker if I don't have the TCP portion to it. You can include it. You just have to keep in mind it might time out before it actually connects. But you'll notice what I really care about here is this little portion. So I'm going to grab this. I'm going to put this inside of my particular script. And if I wanted to make it a little bit more dynamic, I could say this is my server name. And then I can do a format for the string. So I can say server name equals the server name. And just like that, I could have my string. So create our server. I call this like the URL. I know that might not be the most specific or technically correct name, but that's kind of the way I like to think about it. And then from here, you need to define your username and password. Obviously, I'm showing this all to you. Technically, you would not want this to be something that you just kind of lay around. This is technically confidential information, but again, my plan is to delete the database once I actually upload all the videos, so I'm okay sharing it with you all. But this is my current username and password. Yes, I did change it since the last time. And then from here, we can create the full connection string. So this is the kind of the putting it all together. So I'm going to create a new variable. I'm going to call it connection string. It will equal text wrap, dedent. And then I'm going to put it in triple quotes, all the pieces that I need. And the first one is going to be my driver. That's going to be the driver that I specify. I'm going to have my server, that's next. And that's going to be my server. Needs to look exactly like it appears here. Do not uppercase things that are not uppercase. Do not spell things differently. Do not have spaces. It needs to look exactly like it looks right here. So if you start saying, why can't I connect? Check the connection string, because if you do not have it looking exactly like it looks here, there's a good chance it will not connect. I'm going to say that again. The only reason I know that is because I've spent more than enough times going through the headache of going, why is it not connecting? Well, it's because I didn't specify things correctly. We're going to make sure it's encrypted. And then from here, I'm going to say trust server trust server certificate. That's going to equal no. And then finally, I'm going to have connection space timeout equals 30. I like to leave this a little bit higher only because just sometimes the internet's slow or whatever it might be. It might not connect super quickly depending on sometimes things like your internet connection. So be a little bit patient. Don't necessarily expect snappy fast connection, especially if you're on a slow internet. So you want to make sure you give yourself enough time. Finally, we're going to format our strings with all the components that we specified. So obviously the first one is our driver. The second one is our server. The third one is our database. That is our database name. Next one is our username. That's our username. And then finally, we have our password. This is what we specified early on. So now you have your connection strings. We're getting closer to getting something we want. Okay, and then from here, let's create a new PYODBC connection object. So I'm going to do a little bit of a trick just for type hinting. The PYODBC library, it kind of gets a little weird sometimes when it comes to type hinting. It'll return an object, but then it won't list any of the methods or properties for IntelliSense. So especially with PYODBC, I tend to be very explicit, and I want to make sure that when I specify the connection object, I'm using type hinting to say, hey, this is a PYODBC connection object. Again, that's just from experience and working with the library. It really tends to freak out a little bit, and then all of a sudden it won't do certain things. So I tend to be a little bit more explicit. So you'll see that a lot of times in my code that I use it with. And then from here, once I have a new connection object, I'm going to create a cursor object from the connection. And then from here, I'm going to create a new variable called cursor. And just like that connection object, I'm going to specify using type hinting that it is a cursor object, just to make sure there's no confusion. And then from here, if I wanted to, I would probably want to make sure that I actually explicitly close out my connection. I could use an alias, like a handle basically, and do like something like a with statement if I didn't want to have to specify the close. So there's other options as well. So close the connection once we are done. Now we're going to obviously be doing a little bit more than just opening and closing, but I want to make sure first that we can connect before I start doing anything crazy. I didn't see any errors come up after running my script, so that's a great sign. That means that I was able to successfully connect. I think at this point, it probably helps if we do like a test query just to make sure that we can actually pull from a table and then grab everything. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to define a select query, and I'm going to say select SQL, and then I'm going to say int double quotes, select star from, oh, what is the name of that table? News articles CNBC. So we'll take that wonderful table, and let's see what we get from this one. So we have our query. Then from here, we want to execute that query. So at this point, we've just defined it. We haven't actually executed anything. So execute the select query. It's usually always kind of goes in this flow. You define your query, then you execute your query. So we're going to say cursor, and then we're going to do execute, and then select SQL. And then we can do something like this and say results, or something like that. You could also do something like cursor. You could say cursor fetch all. So fetch all of the results from it. So here you're executing it. Here is where you're grabbing that actual data. So grab the data. And if I wanted to be fancy, I could just print this out. So again, you can all see that we are able to successfully connect to it and then execute a query as well. This looks great. So it looks like I'm able to connect and then at the same time pull that data as well. One final thing I want to talk about really briefly is inserting into a database. So we'll be doing this more once we get to the actual data pipeline and inserting stuff. But at this point, we can do something really simple and just define a simple insert query and express how that would look in our Python code. So the next thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to define an insert query. So define an insert query. And so we'll say insert SQL. I'm trying to be consistent. And we're going to say insert into, and then I'm going to do exactly what I did here. Insert into this table. Actually, we don't need that there. And then from here, we're going to insert into that table. Inside of our curly brackets, we're going to specify news ID. news source, and then a GUID. Now, these are just some columns that I specified in my table. This one I have to specify, so I have to specify news ID because I said that one cannot be null. I'm not allowing nulls in this column, so I have to specify it when I insert a new row. These two are optional, but I just wanted to make something, a little bit simple. And then I'm going to specify values. So I'm going to specify values, and then I'm going to use parameterize queries by specifying placeholders for those specific ones. At least I think that's the official name, parameterize. If I remember correctly, the documentation covers it. And then from here, I'm going to define my record set. And then from here, I'm going to say records equals a list, a tuple, and then I'm just going to make some fake data up, nothing super fancy. ABC123, CNBC, and then we'll say 400, something like that. I'm going to do the same thing below. So I'm going to specify two records, two rows of data. We'll say 456, CNBC finance, and then we'll say 700, maybe something like that. And then from here, a nice little trick and kind of comes in here is you can actually specify the data types or the SQL data types of the values that you're about to insert. So define the data types of the input values. So this is kind of neat if you want to be very explicit. So we'll say cursor, set, input size, and then from here, I'm going to put it inside of a list, inside of that tuple, and then I'm going to say PYODBC. I can specify a SQL varchar, if I remember correctly, and then I can specify 50 characters long, and then 0, and then I can just kind of go down from here. So they're all basically the same thing. And then just like that, just for readability, I'll do that. So this is just being a little bit more explicit with the code and saying, hey, I want to specify specific data types as I insert them. And then finally, I would do the actual, so I would actually execute the insert statement. And so I would say cursor, execute, and then I could even do execute many. So with this one, I need to specify the SQL, so the insert SQL, and then I need to specify the parameters. In this case, it would be my records. So I'd say records. And then from here, the important thing is, even though you executed it, doesn't mean you've committed the transaction. This is where things can get a little bit confusing. So you'll execute it and you'll go, why don't I see it in my database? Did you commit the transaction? That's the question you need to ask. So from here, you need to do something like commit, called the commit method. So you could say commit the transactions. Now, there's actually different things you could do. So for example, I could specify my connection and say auto commit equals true. So in this situation, I wouldn't have to explicitly call this, but that's kind of a dangerous option too, because if you start executing a bunch of queries and you don't know what's being executed, you could be dropping tables, you could be deleting records. You don't necessarily want to commit those unless you know that they're happening. So this is a double-edged sword. It will auto commit for you, but that means things could happen that you necessarily don't want to have happen. Additionally, something with the connection is because we're using the execute many, you can actually specify that, I think with the cursor, if I remember correctly. Is it with the cursor? Cursor, fast execute many. So with this one, you could specify that to true. This is if you have a bunch of rows and you want to bulk insert relatively quickly. Now, this does depend. So when you use execute many, it does depend on the driver. So if you read the documentation specifically, I believe, where is it? I think it's this one. He talks about it. If you go down here, yeah, execute many. So this is where things can kind of get confusing because it depends on the cursor. So fast execute many. It's not with every driver that you can use this with. And so I'm trying to find the page where he specifies explicitly which ones you need. Maybe it's this one. Is off by default. Is only recommended for applications that use the Microsoft's ODBC driver for SQL Server. So there's limitations. You just need to make sure that you're using it with the correct driver, because sometimes it won't work the way you think it's going to work. And then basically what happens is it's literally just looping through each record each time. Now you can kind of trick it, and there's ways that you can do a bulk insert by actually creating the entire giant string yourself. You just have to be careful with that, because if you don't know what's being inserted and you don't set it up correctly, you can technically leave yourself open to things like SQL injection and things like that. So you just have to really be careful when you go through that. Or if it's something where it's like it's kind of your own personal code where you're not planning other people to use it, you know, that's a different story. But if it's something where you were actually going to give it to entire groups of people, and then they were going to have access to databases that they might not necessarily know, then that's something you have to be a little bit careful about. So yeah, you just have to keep in mind that execute many, it does work, but it's not going to work across every type of driver and every type of database. So just be aware of that. So this is technically how it would look. So just to kind of prove it to you, I'm going to run this again. Nothing there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this and see if it inserts it for us. Okay, perfect. So no results, which is I was expecting, but let's see if it inserted it. Hey, it inserted it to us. That's exciting. And then I could even select it and then do things from here as well. So really that's how you would insert into your database. Again, we'll talk about this in more detail once we start getting to our little data pipeline. But at this point, though, that's actually the entire video. So if you have any questions related to using PYODBC with the Microsoft Azure SQL database, by all means, put them down in the comments below. Otherwise, in our next video, what we're going to be doing is using the SQL management library inside of the Python Azure SDK. So we're going to see how to manage operations done on our particular databases and servers using the Azure SDK. Keep in mind, we're not going to be doing things like inserting and selecting databases or actually running SQL queries per se. I shouldn't say select databases, as you can technically do that, but actually executing SQL queries and stuff like that, you cannot do that yet currently with the Microsoft Azure SQL management package. So this is more just for actually managing the actual database and doing things like creating new databases or creating new servers and things along that. So that's what we have coming up. But again, if you have any questions, put them down in the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next video.